The crystal chandeliers at Sterling Manor cast delicate rainbows across the polished marble floor as I adjusted the floral centerpieces for the Henderson wedding rehearsal. Each arrangement required precise positioning to create the perfect sight lines for photography while maintaining the elegant flow my sister Melissa had envisioned. After 12 years as a city planning consultant specializing in commercial zoning and permits, I developed an eye for spatial relationships that served me well in many contexts. "The white roses are stunning with the gold accents," Mrs. Henderson said, clasping her hands together as she surveyed the grand ballroom. "This is exactly what Catherine dreamed of for her special day." I smiled, making a final adjustment to the head table's arrangement. "Your daughter has excellent taste. The venue showcases it perfectly." What Mrs. Henderson didn't know was that I'd been volunteering my time to help Melissa's wedding planning business for the past 6 months, not because I needed the work, but because I enjoyed seeing her succeed. My consulting firm, Whitmore & Associates, had been thriving since I'd established it 8 years ago, specializing in helping businesses navigate complex municipal regulations and zoning requirements. "There you are," came a sharp voice from the ballroom entrance. Derek, my brother-in-law, strode across the marble floor wearing his signature navy suit and an expression of barely contained irritation. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room, like storm clouds moving across a previously clear sky. Mrs. Henderson turned toward him with a polite smile. "Mr. Sterling, everything looks absolutely magical. Your team has done wonderful work." Derek's chest puffed slightly at the compliment, though he hadn't contributed anything to the setup beyond signing vendor contracts. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. We pride ourselves on attention to detail and professional excellence." His eyes found mine across the room and I could see the familiar flicker of disdain. Derek had always viewed me as Melissa's underachieving brother, despite never bothering to ask what I actually did for work. In his mind, anyone who didn't flaunt their success obviously didn't have any worth mentioning. "Michael," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he wanted to assert dominance. "Could you step outside for a moment? I need to discuss something with you." I excused myself from Mrs. Henderson and followed Derek onto the venue's stone terrace. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the carefully maintained gardens, creating the romantic ambience that made Sterling Manor one of the city's most sought-after wedding locations. "What can I do for you, Derek?" I asked, genuinely curious about what had prompted this interruption. He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of discomfort and manufactured authority. "Look, I appreciate that you've been helping Melissa with some of the setup work, but I think it's time we made some changes to how things operate around here." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. Derek had a tendency to build dramatic tension before delivering what he considered important pronouncements. "The truth is," he said, straightening his tie, "Sterling Manor has reached a level of prestige that requires us to be very selective about our image and associations. Our clients expect a certain caliber of professionalism." "I understand," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure where this conversation was heading. Derek's voice took on that condescending tone he'd perfected over the years. "Michael, your family and I respect that. But we can't have unemployed people around our high-end clients. It reflects poorly on the business." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were accurate but because of the casual cruelty with which he delivered them. Mrs. Henderson was still inside, praising the work I'd done on her daughter's centerpieces, while Derek stood here reducing me to what he perceived as a charity case. "Our clients pay premium prices for premium experiences," he continued, oblivious to the impact of his words. "They expect to interact with successful professionals, not." He gestured vaguely in my direction. "Well, you understand." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that appeared whenever Derek demonstrated his remarkable ability to combine ignorance with arrogance. He had no idea that Whitmore & Associates had handled the permitting and zoning compliance for half the commercial developments in this district, including several of his competitors' venues. "So what are you suggesting?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the anger building inside me. "I think it would be best if you stepped back from the client-facing aspects of the business," Derek said, his tone suggesting he thought he was being generous. "Maybe you could help with behind-the-scenes work, loading and unloading, that sort of thing. Away from the guests." The irony was almost overwhelming. Derek, who had inherited Sterling Manor from his father and had never worked a day in the hospitality industry before taking over, was lecturing me about professionalism. He'd never obtained a single permit, navigated a zoning hearing, or dealt with the complex regulations that governed commercial event spaces. Of course, I said quietly, nodding politely. I wouldn't want to create any problems for the business. Derek's face relaxed, clearly relieved that I wasn't going to argue. I knew you'd understand. Family has to make sacrifices for the greater good sometimes. As we walked back into the ballroom, I caught Melissa's eye. She was arranging place cards at the head table, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She'd obviously overheard at least part of our conversation through the open terrace doors. "Everything all right?" she asked softly as Derek moved across the room to speak with Mrs. Henderson. "Everything's fine," I replied, giving her arm a reassuring squeeze. "Just a minor scheduling discussion." But everything wasn't fine. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the files I kept on all major commercial properties in the district. Sterling Manor's folder was particularly thick, filled with permit applications, zoning variances, and compliance reports dating back 15 years. Derek had no idea that his venue operated under a conditional use permit that required annual renewal and strict adherence to occupancy limits, noise restrictions, and parking requirements. He also didn't know that several of his recent events had exceeded the approved capacity limits, or that neighbors had been filing informal complaints about late-night noise and traffic violations. I picked up my phone and dialed the city planning office. Janet Morrison, the chief compliance officer, answered on the second ring. "Michael, good to hear from you. How's the consulting business?" "Thriving, thanks. Janet, I need to schedule a routine inspection of the Sterling Manor event venue on Riverside Drive. We've had some citizen inquiries about compliance with their conditional use permit." "Sterling Manor? I haven't been out there in almost 2 years. What kind of concerns?" "Occupancy limits, noise ordinances, parking capacity. The usual issues that crop up when venues get busy. Nothing urgent, but we should probably do a thorough review." Janet's voice carried the professional efficiency I'd worked with for years. "I can schedule something for next week. Tuesday or Wednesday work for you to accompany the inspection. Actually, I think this one should be a surprise visit. Sometimes venue operators prepare too carefully when they know inspectors are coming. We want to see normal operating conditions." "Good point. I'll have Inspector Rodriguez handle it. He's thorough but fair." After hanging up, I spent the next hour reviewing Sterling Manor's permit history. Derek's father had been meticulous about compliance, but since Derek took over 3 years ago, there had been a noticeable decline in attention to regulatory details. The venue had been operating on autopilot, coasting on its established reputation while gradually accumulating small violations that could become major problems under scrutiny. The following Tuesday, I was in my downtown office when Janet called with an update on the Sterling Manor inspection. "Michael, you were right to flag this property. Rodriguez found multiple compliance issues. They're exceeding occupancy limits, the kitchen modifications weren't properly permitted, and they're using areas for events that aren't covered under their conditional use permit." "How serious are the violations?" "Serious enough to require immediate corrective action. We're issuing a formal notice of violation with 30 days to cure. If they don't address all issues, we'll have to suspend their operating permit." That afternoon, Melissa called me, her voice shaking with worry. "Michael, something terrible happened. A city inspector showed up at the venue this morning and found all sorts of problems. Derek is panicking." "What kind of problems?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Capacity violations, unpermitted renovations, zoning issues. The inspector said they might shut us down if we don't fix everything within 30 days. Derek is beside himself. He's talking about hiring lawyers and fighting the city." I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and genuine concern for my sister's business. Fighting the city rarely works, Melissa. The violations are either legitimate or they're not. That's what I told him, but he's convinced this is some kind of harassment. He keeps saying the timing is suspicious, that someone must have reported us out of spite. Derek's paranoia was impressive, considering he was absolutely right. Someone had reported them and it was definitely out of spite. But his problems weren't caused by malicious reporting. They were caused by years of ignoring regulations and operating on the assumption that rules didn't apply to successful businesses. Has he considered hiring a consultant to help with the compliance issues? I suggested carefully. He mentioned that, but he's worried about the cost. We're already looking at thousands of dollars in fines and corrections. 2 weeks into the 30-day cure period, Derek still hadn't taken meaningful action to address the violations. Instead, he'd chosen to ignore them while hoping they would disappear. Melissa called me on a Thursday evening, sounding exhausted. "Michael, I need to ask you something, and please be honest. Do you know anything about city planning and permits?" I paused, considering how much to reveal. "I know a little." "Why?" "Derek won't admit it, but we're in serious trouble. The violations are real and we can't figure out how to fix them. He's too proud to ask for help, but I'm terrified we're going to lose everything. What if I took a look at the notice? Maybe I could offer some suggestions." "Would you?" "Derek would never agree to it, but maybe if I showed him you had some ideas." The next morning, I reviewed the formal violation notice Derek had received. Inspector Rodriguez had been thorough, documenting every deviation from approved plans and permitted uses. The violations ranged from minor issues like inadequate exit signage to major problems like using the venue's wine cellar for receptions without proper permits. I spent 3 hours preparing a comprehensive compliance plan that would address every violation while minimizing costs and disruption to the business. The solution required careful coordination with multiple city departments, strategic scheduling of improvements, and detailed documentation of all corrective actions. When I finished, I had created a roadmap that would not only solve Derek's immediate problems but also position Sterling Manor for long-term success within the regulatory framework. The plan represented exactly the kind of expertise that Derek had dismissed as unemployable. I called Melissa and asked her to meet me for coffee. When she arrived at the small cafe near my office, she looked more stressed than I'd seen her in years. "Michael, I don't know what we're going to do. Derek hired a lawyer who charged him $3,000 to basically tell him he needs to comply with the violations. We're running out of time and money." I slid the compliance plan across the table. "This addresses every issue on the violation notice. It's organized by priority and includes cost estimates for each correction." Melissa's eyes widened as she flipped through the detailed document. "Michael, this is incredible. Where did you learn to do this?" "I've been doing municipal compliance consulting for 12 years. Whitmore and Associates has handled permitting for most of the major commercial developments in this area." She stared at me in shock. "You own a consulting company?" "I founded it 8 years ago. We specialize in exactly these kinds of regulatory issues." Melissa's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God. Derek called you unemployed. He banned you from client events because he thought you were some kind of charity case." "I know. Michael, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell us what you do?" I thought about how to answer that question honestly, because I wanted to see how Derek treated people he thought couldn't help him. It told me everything I needed to know about his character. That evening, Melissa confronted Derek with the compliance plan and my credentials. According to her later account, he spent an hour insisting it was impossible, that I was lying about my business, and that the whole situation was an elaborate setup to embarrass him. Finally, desperate and running out of options, Derek called me directly. "Michael." His voice was strained, lacking its usual arrogance. "Melissa says you might be able to help with our permit situation." "I might be able to offer some guidance," I replied neutrally. "Look, if you really do know about this stuff, maybe we could work something out. Professional consultation, fair rates." I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "Derek, 2 weeks ago you told me that Sterling Manor couldn't have unemployed people around high-end clients. You said it reflected poorly on your business." His uncomfortable laugh carried no humor. "I may have misjudged your professional situation." "You didn't misjudge anything. You made assumptions based on ignorance and arrogance, then used those assumptions to humiliate me in front of clients I'd been helping for months." The silence that followed was profound. When Derek finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand that the person you banned from your venue for being unemployable has spent the last 12 years becoming one of the most respected municipal compliance consultants in the region. I want you to realize that your business is failing not because of city harassment, but because you've been operating in violation of regulations for years." "Can you fix this?" he asked quietly. "Yes. But not as a favor to you. I'll do it as a business arrangement at my standard consulting rates, because Melissa deserves better than watching her career destroyed by your incompetence. 3 weeks later, Sterling Manor passed its compliance reinspection with flying colors. Every violation had been corrected, the venue was operating within all permitted parameters, and Derek had learned more about municipal regulations in 1 month than he'd bothered to learn in 3 years of ownership. The total cost of my consulting services was exactly what Derek had budgeted for his failed legal strategy. The difference was that my approach actually solved the problems instead of just fighting them. On the day of the successful reinspection, Derek found me reviewing the final compliance documentation in Sterling Manor's office. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "Michael, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." I looked up from the paperwork. "You owe me professional respect, Derek. The apologies are between you and your conscience." He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about what you said about assumptions and arrogance. You were right. I judged you without knowing anything about your actual capabilities. The problem wasn't that you misjudged my capabilities," I corrected. "The problem was that you treated someone you perceived as less successful with contempt. That says everything about your character and nothing about mine." 6 months later, Sterling Manor was thriving under proper regulatory compliance, and Derek had developed what Melissa described as a newfound respect for professional expertise. He'd also hired me as the venue's permanent compliance consultant, ensuring that future inspections would find a model operation. I continued helping with event setups, but now Derek introduced me to clients as our municipal compliance specialist, rather than trying to hide me in the background. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who once banned me for being unemployable now used my credentials as a selling point for his business. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's demonstrating competence so thoroughly that your critics have no choice but to acknowledge their own failures. Derek had learned that lesson the hard way, and Sterling Manor was better for it.